So in today's video, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about running a Star Trek game and some lessons learned. So this is a Star Trek game I ran, in fact, just last night from before when I recorded this video. And so let's talk about why. I generally run Dungeons & Dragons on Thursday nights. However, I needed a break. And I hear this from other dungeon masters too, sometimes online. You know, sometimes it can wear you down running Dungeons & Dragons week after week after week. So I just needed a break and needed to look at another genre a little bit. So the system we ran was Starships and Spacemen. And I'll have a link to where you can buy the book in the description. I didn't write it, but I did review it, and I'll put a link to my review there too. So you can see, if we look at this character sheet, how there's not a whole lot here. And in fact, if you took out the psionic powers, because this is a Vulcan science officer, if you took out his special Vulcan powers, it would be even sleeker. So it's a lot lighter of a system than Dungeons & Dragons is, at least most versions after 3rd edition. So Starships and Spacemen is a very rules-light game. And that's kind of what I needed at this point. So let's take a look at some of the scenes from the game last night and some things that I learned. So in the first opening act, their little Federation ship was approaching a planet. Now this planet, there was a colony on it, and they lost contact. And the colony is kind of near the Klingon neutral zone. So I had 3 players who were available, and I'm very grateful they gave the system a try last night. And as soon as they came out of warp around the planet, they're faced with the Imperial Star Destroyer from Star Wars. And they had a little starship combat there, and decided to retreat because they were pretty much outmatched, decided to retreat to the other side of the planet, and then they find out that this whole Imperial Star Destroyer, this spaceship, was an illusion. And they hear in the back of their minds the voice of this great entity who seems to be laughing and playing games with them. Now, when we did the starship combat here, you'll notice there's no hex grid or graph grid or anything like that. We really played it theater of the mind. So the players did some rolls, and I did a little bit of bean counting too, and I did some rolls, and I kind of told them, here's what the situation is with your ship at this point. So what was the lesson learned here? It worked fine. It worked fine as a cinematic scene. It wasn't like a war game or, a miniatures game, but it worked fine, and we got through it. Now, a lesson learned here, if I were going to run this week in and week out, I think I would have to either use their system from the book in a little more detail, or maybe look at adapting another system and maybe making it a little bit more rigorous. But really, for a quick game, the theater of the mind approach really just worked fine. Now, of course, they beam down to the planet to try and find these colonists, and they find that the colony's been deserted, and they get attacked by this indigenous life form, which is the thing that kind of looks like a pine cone there. In fact, our doctor there got paralyzed by the bite of one of them, by the sting of one of them. So they decided after a couple of rounds to retreat inside the colony, and the engineer wanted to electrify the door. Seemed reasonable, and he made his roll, so they were able to electrify the door, and that scared off the creatures. So maybe one of the lessons learned here was that the roles and the skills are important, and I think you need them for drama, but also the rule of reasonable should come into account. This was a colony. It wasn't long deserted. You have an engineer there. There was electrical power. Reasonably, he should be able to do this, and I only asked for a roll because he's trying to do it in a combat situation. So sometimes we don't need to roll for every single little thing, or only have them roll if it seems like it would be stressful. Really, if he had had a few hours to rig that up, I wouldn't have even asked for a roll. So they come and they find the colony deserted, and they find these crystals. So they decide to head up to the hills outside of town where they knew that there were these crystals. Now, this was an interesting scene for me because they get up there, and there's an entrance to a mine or a cavern, and they find, since they're near the Klingon neutral zone, that there's some Klingons there, either guarding the edge of the mine or maybe debating about whether to go into the mine. And I really thought this was going to be a role-playing situation. That's really what I thought. They were going to approach the Klingons and have to parlay and maybe convince them or threaten them to move along or something like that. They didn't do that at all. They took some of those cone creatures and aimed them towards the Klingons and scared them into the mine. So it became not a role-playing situation, but more of a problem-solving. So I guess the lesson learned here, and all these lessons are things I think we already all know as Dungeon Masters, but it's good to see them again. You know, that just because I think this scene's going to go a certain way, it doesn't have to, and I shouldn't force it to go a certain way. It's not ultimately my story, it's the player's story. Now, inside the mine, they met the super powerful, almost omnipotent creature, the one who set the illusion of the Star Destroyer after them. And you'll see his picture in a second. And what they were able to do was convince him to conjure up images of all these tribbles and scare the Klingons out of the mine. So that got rid of them, and they didn't fire a shot at all. Again, it was something that seemed reasonable. If there were enough tribbles, that the Klingons would probably leave. So we kind of used the rule of reasonableness. And also what was very different about this was I kind of thought this might be, the big boss fight like you usually have at the end of a dungeon. They didn't do that. They really wanted to kind of avoid that because they felt they were outnumbered and try and use other resources that they had at hand. Now, you can't quite see the omnipotent being there on the picture here. It was Lucian, who was in one of the animated Star Trek episodes. He's kind of a satyr-like creature, and he's very powerful. And there was a portal that brought him into this world unwillingly. The crystals that are in the mine and in the ground opened up this portal. The science wasn't real strong here. It was a little hand wavy. And in fact, opening that portal is what had caused the colonists to get sick. And they actually found out that the person they thought was the villain had brought the colonists here, and he had the colonists in suspended animation in order to preserve them and to try and help them out. So our heroes here, the three of them, decided they were going to use the power from their phasers to energize the crystals and open the portal and send Lucian back. And then, of course, help the colonists there revive. And everything had a nice happy ending. So I guess what I had to learn here was be very flexible. They didn't want to fight this guy. They didn't want to fight the Klingons. They wanted to use their resources rather than that and, survive. And that's how this session ended. Now, you may not want to run a Star Trek game. That's fine. Let's take a look here at the end and see if there's any lessons that were learned which could apply to any genre, because I think they can. For me, it was very good to run a different genre, even for just one night. I read an article recently about types of rests, that sometimes we need physical rest, and sometimes we need intellectual rest, and sometimes we need social rest. We need to be away from people or, certain people. Sometimes we need a little solitude. And in a way, this was a type of creative rest. I got to turn off what I usually do and the way I usually try to design a D&D scenario and try something else. So even though it was work putting it together, it was definitely a creative rest from what I usually do, and I'm very grateful to my players for giving me that opportunity. I also think what I learned that could be applied to other genres is the importance of a guest star. So in this case, Lucian was the guest star, and he was a bit flamboyant and happy-go-lucky and like a trickster. And if you think about a lot of the classic Star Trek episodes, you have Khan and you have some of the Klingons and Trelane, Harry Mudd. You have a lot of very interesting and kind of larger than life sometimes guest stars. Again, I think we also have to always remember not to let the NPC, take the stage constantly, but I think a little bit of hammy acting and a little bit over the top, can make the session memorable, provided it doesn't take away too much from the players. Absolutely. Another lesson learned was you don't necessarily need to the death combats and the big boss fight, and everything doesn't need to progress kind of in the way that it always has. So, that's just something that was a nice breath of fresh air for a change. And they also use more technological problem solving. The rule of reasonable. If it's around and it seems reasonable, yeah, it probably should work, or they should at least get a roll. Now, you might say, well, I only run D&D. True. But, maybe it's making me think about maybe in some of these rooms, I need to leave some junk around, have some more stuff, more things in these rooms that players might be able to improvise with. Also, I think it was good to run a different system, not just a different genre, but running a different system. One thing I saw was a lighter system ran kind of quicker. I thought we got a lot done in about an hour and a half, an hour and 40 minutes last night. We really did. We got through a lot of scenes and we were able to resolve some things pretty quickly. In fact, one of the players even commented, that because there's not a big skill list, he didn't have to hunt through things and say, okay, which is the perfect skill that I should use here? There's a few broad skill groups and we ran with it. I also think that the lighter system is always better if you're doing players who are new to a system or especially for a one-shot. So for example, for something like a convention game, if someone is a newer player, a lighter system like STARSHIPS and SPACEMEN or the number of lighter system probably work better because there's not a whole lot new stuff to learn. But also running a different system, I did see some areas for improvement in the system. For example, as we played through, I realized I'm not sure I was crazy about the stun rules in the main rule book. I don't know if they were explained as well as I liked, or maybe I missed that in the reading. So I think that's something I'd like to improve. And I would also maybe like to take a look at the Starship combat system and how could I make it, so that every player is involved, especially if I had a larger group. So I think it's kind of like when you learn another language other than your birth language, you learn a lot about languages. So when you run a different game system, you learn a lot about, well, here's how other systems do it. And maybe I could bring some of that to whatever game we run more traditionally. So here's my hope. My hope for you is that you get to try a new game or a new genre this year, maybe even as soon as you can. And I hope myself that I get the chance to run some different genres other than fantasy. Not that I'm not going to run fantasy, but, that I get a chance to spread my wings a little bit and try some different things. Now to end, if you liked the video, give it a like or a thumbs up, or if you want to make a comment in the comments below, that'd be great. If you want to support the channel, you can take a look at the Sharp Mountain Games products that we have. We have modules, character classes, maps, and NPC cards. And all the places you can find them, like Roll20 and Drive-Thru, Amazon and Lulu, are in the description below. So thanks very much for watching.